It's been 752 days since the 2016 election, and for what seems like the 752nd day in a row, the lead story at every news outlet in this country is Russia! Yes, Russia, a remote country in Central Asia with a median life expectancy lower than that of Honduras, a place with an economy about the size of that of the state of Texas, a vodka-soaked ice-scape whose shuffling workforce can't seem to build a reliable airplane. That's Russia. But nevertheless, it's a place that somehow, against all odds, manages to dictate election outcomes on the other side of the world, using a crack team of secret agents so stealthy, we still don't know their names after more than 2 years of investigating it. Russia! According to cable news, Russia is the most important country in the world. Today's installment of the Russia saga has something to do with Michael Cohen and a potential real estate deal in Moscow. Now, the deal never actually happened, not that it would have made any difference had it happened. Foreign investment is still legal, even in Russia, but whatever. This is a huge, huge deal, the hugest deal. It changes everything forever. Watch.
This president may not serve out his term, that Bob Mueller may have enough that there is both intense legal and intense political jeopardy for the president of the United States.
You know, today's the first day I actually thought Donald Trump might not finish his term in office.
Really?
I mean, I think this thing is enormous.
Yeah. Today is a good day for Donald Trump to resign. I really believe that.
This thing is enormous. He's resigning. So once again, the administration is doomed because of Russia. We'll see. What's remarkable, though, is that for the past couple of years, as the geniuses on cable television have been sounding the relentless alarm about our mortal foe, Vladimir Putin, an actual threat to America has been rising in the East. If you're looking for a country to fret about, forget about Russia. The Russians may pose a threat to Montenegro and Ukraine, but Phoenix and Buffalo remain safe. The real danger to this country is China, and everybody in power knows that. The FBI director, Christopher Wray, describes China as by far the biggest espionage threat we face. Federal officials estimate there are thousands of Chinese nationals in America right now acting as spies, working to steal sensitive U.S. technologies. Some of these work for the Chinese military, which, by the way, is growing at a much faster rate than our military, or for that matter, Russia's. Meanwhile, China is literally poisoning the American population. Synthetic opioids are the main driver of the drug epidemic that has killed more than 70,000 Americans in just the last year. China is the biggest source of these drugs. The Chinese government has done virtually nothing to stop the flow of them. Why would they? This is war, and they're winning. Now, you might think our media would have noticed all of this and maybe written a story or two about it, but no. Many of them, it turns out, are on the Chinese payroll, too. Vox.com recently published a nauseatingly sycophantic piece written by a reporter who had just traveled to China, it turns out, on the Chinese government's dime. Over at Jeff Bezos' Washington Post, you'll periodically see an entire insert called China Watch. It looks like a news section. It reads like the rest of the paper. In fact, it's literally a product of Chinese state media. They paid to place it, just as they pay to influence numerous think tanks around Washington, as well as many colleges and universities throughout the country. It's a huge propaganda push that is almost never noted by anybody. And it costs a lot, but over time, it's worth it. The Chinese get what they pay for. A compliant American establishment that uses fake threats, manufactured threats from Russia, to obscure real and imminent threats from China. Turns out there really are traitors in Washington, but they're not working for the Kremlin. Julian Epstein is a former chief counsel for Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee, and he joins us tonight. So, Julian, you and I both live in Washington, and we know personally a lot of people who are in effect on the Chinese payroll. Madeleine Albright has made a lot of money from China. John Boehner, the former Republican speaker, works for a firm that lobbies for China. Jim Wolfensohn ran the World Bank, advises the Chinese Sovereign Wealth Fund, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How many people do you know who are openly working for Russia in Washington?
I think your basic point that the Chinese are a greater long-term threat to us than Russia is, I think that's true. I think in the 1970s, China had about 1% of the flows of world trade. They now have about 25%.
Right, exactly.
They're about 2% of the global economy. Within the decade, they will be equal to the size of the U.S. economy. By 2050, they will be twice the size of the U.S. economy. I think we thought when we brought them into the World Trade Organization in 2001 that it would help them play fair, and I think what we've seen since then is that they've cheated. They've stolen intellectual property. Up until 2014, they were certainly manipulating the currency. I don't think they play by the rules, and I think one of the things I agree with the president on is to get tough with China. I would approach it differently than he does, but I think he's right to get tough on China. I think the media ought to focus more on it. It's not as sensational, so it's not going to get good ratings on cable television, but it's a real problem. The disappearing middle class and working class is a real problem. It's not sensational. It's not going to be a sugar high for cable television, so I don't think you're going to have any of the networks, not this network, not CNN, not MSNBC, any of them focusing on those issues, because you just don't get the sugar high from that. That's not to say Russia isn't a threat. I mean, Russia has done lots of things. All of our intelligence agencies in Republican and Democratic administrations have agreed that even though they're 1% of the world economy, they still do lots of things that are directly oppositional to us and that are trying to destabilize our interests, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in the Balkans, whether it's in the UK. It doesn't mean that they're not a real threat and there's not something to take seriously, but I think your basic point is correct, which is that we are sleeping while Rome burns with respect to China, and we have not taken seriously the fact that they don't play by the rules. We have...
Wait, so I'm waiting to jump in with a hostile question, but you're making my case for me. You've taken all of my questions and reformatted them into statements, because I think you're absolutely right. So
I agree with the meta-thesis.
Well, okay, because I think
meta-thesis.
It's hard to... And thank you for being honest about that. And by the way, it's not a partisan thing. There are a ton of Republicans working on behalf of China, I'm embarrassed to say.
And Democrats are finally waking up. I think that there is a real threat that China does not play by the rules and that it's something to take very seriously. Again, I would approach it differently than the president, but I think he's right to say this is a real problem.
But there's all this moral outrage about Russia and Saudi Arabia, neither of which I've ever been in favor of, by the way. I'm not carrying water for either one. But the idea that a country we're allied with assassinates one of its political opponents, yeah, it's bad. But, I mean, that is a practically daily occurrence in China, and no one says anything about it. And I just wonder, should we treat the people in Washington, who have a lot of power, who are getting rich from China, should we treat them as traitors in the same way that we treat anyone who deals with Russia as a traitor?
Look, I think your point about even-handedness is well taken. I think the Chinese do horrible things to journalists and to dissidents, and they get a pass on it. I think in a lot of cases, the social media giants, Facebook and Google, enable a lot of the bad behavior that's going on in a lot of autocratic regimes. We don't hear that much about it, although that's starting to get covered. I think if your point is proportionality, does the news, and particularly cable news, does it cover these things in the proper proportionality? I agree with that meta point that you're making. It doesn't mean to say that when the Saudis go and kill an American journalist, we shouldn't be getting tough on the Saudis. It doesn't mean to say if the Russians create a military intelligence attack on the United States, that that's not something we shouldn't take seriously, and we should get to the bottom of that. But I think your basic point is that, you know, there is selective outrage, there is a lot of chest thumping, there is a lot of kind of, you know, morally superior indignation that occurs on the Russia issue. And, you know, you and I may have slightly different views on the Russia issue. I'm trying to
argue with you, Julian Epstein, but it's proving absolutely impossible. You did a better job than I could have in making that case. But,
you know, there's a lot of self-righteousness on certain issues, and I think there's reason to be upset about what happened with Russia. There's reason to be upset with Saudi Arabia. But I think if you're going to be outraged on those issues, your point is correct that you should be equally outraged on the abuses that are occurring in China.
And the
accuses in China are very, very serious, and you're exactly right about that.
Julian Epstein, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Good to see you, Tucker. Okay.
Gordon Chang has been thinking about these questions for a very long time.